Experts. They thought it was a family portrait, but the doll in the corner told a different story. The autumn rain fell steadily against the tall windows of the Boston Historical Preservation Society as Emma Richardson carefully positioned another Victorian-era photograph under her high-resolution scanner. It was late October 2024, and she was 3 months into restoring and digitizing a collection of 19th-century family portraits donated by a prominent Massachusetts estate. Emma had worked as a photographic restoration specialist for 15 years, and she approached each image with meticulous attention to detail. Most photographs in this particular collection were predictable for the era: formal family portraits, wedding photographs, and commemorative images marking significant life events. The subjects typically wore their finest clothing and maintained the stiff, serious expressions required by long exposure times. But when she lifted a particular photograph from its protective tissue paper, something about it immediately caught her attention. The image showed a family of 5 posed in an elaborately furnished Victorian parlor. The father stood behind an ornate settee, one hand resting on his wife's shoulder. The mother sat primly, her dark dress elaborate with lace and beading. 3 children were arranged around them, 2 boys standing to the left, a girl of perhaps 8 seated to the right. The composition was formal and typical, the lighting professional, the subjects appropriately solemn. Nothing seemed unusual at first glance, but Emma's trained eye noticed something odd in the lower right corner of the photograph, partially obscured by the shadows and the aged quality of the print. She turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded ink, was a notation: "The Family, Boston, November 1889. Emma returned the photograph to her scanner and began the digitization process, capturing the image at extremely high resolution so she could examine every detail during the restoration work. As the scan completed and appeared on her computer monitor, she zoomed in on different sections, assessing the damage and planning her restoration approach. She examined the father's face first, noting the stern expression typical of the period. Then the mother, whose eyes seemed to hold a particular sadness. The children appeared healthy and well-dressed, though their expressions were carefully neutral as was customary. Then Emma zoomed in on that odd element in the lower right corner that had initially caught her attention. What she saw made her pause, her fingers frozen on the mouse. Sitting in the corner, partially in shadow but clearly visible under magnification, was a doll. Not a toy carelessly left in the frame, but a large porcelain doll, perhaps 2 feet tall, seated formally in a small wooden chair as if it were part of the family portrait. The doll was dressed elaborately in Victorian children's clothing, a white dress with lace trim, tiny buttoned shoes, and a bonnet. Its porcelain face, though cracked with age, was painted with rosy cheeks and delicate features. But what struck Emma as truly strange was the doll's positioning. It wasn't placed casually or accidentally. It was posed deliberately, sitting upright with its hands folded in its lap, positioned at the same formal angle as the human subjects. Emma leaned closer to her monitor, increasing the magnification further. As the image enlarged, she could see more disturbing details. The doll's glass eyes seemed to stare directly at the camera with an unsettling intensity, and there was something written on a small tag attached to the doll's dress, though she couldn't quite make out the text at this resolution. Emma spent the next hour examining every detail of the photograph under maximum digital magnification. The more she looked, the more questions emerged. She documented the doll's position carefully, noting that it sat in a child-sized wooden chair that matched the formal furniture arrangement of the parlor. The chair was positioned as if it were part of the family grouping, not pushed aside or treated as an afterthought. But there was something else. Just to the left of the doll's chair, partially visible in the shadows, was another chair. This one was empty. It was slightly larger than the doll's chair, sized for a young child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. The empty chair was turned at the same angle as the other family members' positions, suggesting it had been deliberately placed there as part of the composition. Emma enhanced the shadows and adjusted the exposure levels digitally, bringing out details that had been lost in the aged photograph. The empty chair became more visible, and she could see that it had a small cushion on the seat, as if prepared for someone who never arrived. She zoomed in on the doll's dress, focusing on that small tag she had noticed earlier. With careful digital enhancement, she was able to make out the embroidered text. Charlotte. It was a name, carefully stitched in delicate script on what appeared to be a handmade label attached to the doll's clothing. Emma sat back from her computer, her mind working through the possibilities. Victorian families sometimes included cherished toys or pets in formal portraits, but this seemed different. The deliberate positioning of the doll, the empty chair beside it, the formal presentation, it all suggested something more significant than simply including a favorite plaything. She had heard of Victorian memorial photography, a practice where deceased family members were sometimes photographed as if they were still alive, or where photographs were taken specifically to commemorate the dead. But she had never seen a case where a doll was used as a substitute for a deceased child in a family portrait. Emma pulled up historical databases and began researching Victorian photographic practices, memorial customs, and the cultural significance of dolls in 19th century America. What she found was both fascinating and disturbing. During the Victorian era, child mortality was tragically common, and families developed elaborate rituals for mourning and remembering their lost children. One practice that emerged in her research was particularly relevant. Some grieving parents would commission family portraits that included representations of their deceased children. Sometimes this meant including a photograph of the deceased child held by a family member. Other times it meant leaving a space in the composition where the child would have stood or sat, creating a visual absence that honored their memory. But the use of a doll as a stand-in for a deceased child was less commonly documented, though not unheard of. Emma found several academic papers describing cases where families had included dolls dressed in the deceased child's clothing, or dolls that had been specially made to resemble the lost child. The empty chair next to the doll suddenly took on new meaning. Perhaps it represented where the child would have sat. Perhaps the doll, dressed elaborately and positioned formally, was meant to serve as a memorial presence for a daughter named Charlotte who had died. Emma needed more information. She examined the photograph again, this time focusing on the family members' expressions and body language. With fresh understanding of possible Victorian memorial practices, Emma returned to examining the family's faces and postures with new attention to detail. She enhanced each face individually, studying the subtle emotional cues that the formal photographic conventions of the era couldn't entirely suppress. The father stood rigid and stern, his hand resting heavily on his wife's shoulder. His expression was controlled, almost aggressively neutral, but there was tension visible in the set of his jaw and the way his fingers pressed into the fabric of his wife's dress. His eyes, even in the aged photograph, seemed to look past the camera rather than directly into it. The mother's face was more revealing. Her expression held profound sadness that no amount of Victorian stoicism could fully mask. Her eyes were slightly downcast, not meeting the camera's gaze, and there was a tightness around her mouth that suggested barely contained emotion. Her hands, folded carefully in her lap, gripped each other with what appeared to be considerable force. The three visible children showed varying reactions. The older boy, perhaps 10 years old, stood stiffly with an expression of confused solemnity, as if he didn't fully understand why the occasion demanded such gravity. The younger boy, maybe 7, looked frightened. His eyes were wide and his small hand clutched at his brother's jacket. The girl of 8 sat with perfect posture, but her face showed signs of recent crying. Her eyes were slightly swollen, and her expression was one of carefully maintained composure that might collapse at any moment. Emma zoomed in on the background details of the parlor. The room was elegantly furnished with heavy Victorian furniture, elaborate wallpaper, and carefully arranged decorative items. But something was off about the arrangement. On the wall behind the family, she could see the outline where a frame had been removed, a lighter rectangle on the wallpaper indicating something had hung there for years before being taken down recently. On a side table, partially visible in the frame, there were flowers. White lilies, traditionally associated with death and funerals in Victorian culture. The flowers were fresh, arranged in an ornate vase, and positioned prominently enough to be clearly visible in the photograph. Emma enhanced another section of the background and noticed what appeared to be a mourning wreath on the door leading out of the parlor. A circular arrangement of dark flowers and ribbons, another traditional Victorian symbol of death in the household. These were not subtle details. This was clearly a household in mourning, and the photograph had been taken during that mourning period. But who had died? If it was a child named Charlotte, where was the child buried? When had she died? And most importantly, why had the family chosen to include the doll and the empty chair in what should have been a memorial portrait? Emma returned her focus to the doll itself. Under extreme magnification, she could see that the doll's porcelain face had several small cracks, suggesting it was not new when the photograph was taken. It was a well-used, perhaps well-loved toy that had seen considerable handling. The doll's clothing, while elaborate, also showed signs of wear. The white dress had small stains visible under enhanced imaging, and the lace trim was slightly frayed in places. This wasn't a pristine memorial object created specifically for the photograph. It was a real child's doll, probably played with extensively. Emma zoomed in on the doll's glass eyes, using her most advanced enhancement tools. As Emma applied sophisticated digital enhancement to the doll's glass eyes, she noticed something that made her breath catch. The Victorian photographer had used bright lighting to properly expose the subjects, and that intense light had been captured as a reflection in the doll's glossy glass eyes. At first, this seemed like a normal photographic artifact, light reflecting off a shiny surface. But as she enhanced and clarified the reflection, she realized it showed more than just the photographer's lamp. There, in the tiny curved surface of the doll's right eye, magnified now to fill her entire monitor, was a reflected image of something, or someone, standing just outside the main composition of the photograph. The reflection was distorted by the curve of the glass eye and degraded by the age of the photograph, but Emma could make out what appeared to be the figure of a small child. The figure was blurred and ghostly in the reflection, but she could distinguish the outline of a white dress and what might have been long light-colored hair. Emma's heart raced. Was this a photographic double exposure? Had someone been standing behind the photographer during the exposure? Or was this some kind of Victorian photographic trick designed to create the impression of a spiritual presence? She knew that Victorian spirit photography had been popular during this period, with photographers deliberately creating double exposures or using other techniques to produce images of ghosts for grieving families who wanted to believe their deceased loved ones were still present. Had this photographer employed such a technique to create the appearance of Charlotte's spirit watching over her family? Emma enhanced the reflection further, trying to bring out more detail. The figure in the reflection was positioned where someone would stand if they were just behind and to the left of the photographer, close enough to the camera to be captured in the doll's eye, but outside the main frame of the family portrait. But something didn't match typical spirit photography. Those fabricated images usually showed the ghost clearly visible in the main photograph, often appearing translucent or glowing. This reflection was accidental, something that would only be visible under extreme magnification using technology that didn't exist in 1889. No Victorian viewer would have been able to see this detail, which meant, if it was real, it was genuinely capturing something that had been present during the photograph, but was not intended to be part of the composition. Emma documented everything carefully, creating enhanced versions of different sections of the photograph and organizing them in a detailed digital folder. She needed expert consultation. This was beyond simple photographic restoration. This was potentially a significant historical discovery that raised questions about Victorian memorial practices, photographic techniques, and what exactly had happened in that Boston parlor in November 1889. She pulled up her professional contacts and found Dr. Michael Torres, a colleague at MIT who specialized in historical photography and photographic analysis. Michael had expertise in Victorian-era photography techniques and access to advanced imaging technology that could help determine whether the reflection she was seeing was an original part of the photograph or some kind of later manipulation or artifact. Emma called him immediately. "Michael, I need your help with something unusual. I'm working on a Victorian family portrait from 1889, and I found what appears to be a reflection in a doll's eye that shows a figure not visible in the main composition." Dr. Michael Torres arrived at the Boston Historical Preservation Society the following morning, bringing with him portable spectral imaging equipment and his laptop loaded with specialized photographic analysis software. Emma had the original photograph laid out on her examination table, along with her computer displaying the various enhanced sections she had created. Michael was in his mid-40s, a meticulous researcher with a background in both photography history and forensic imaging. He had worked on several high-profile cases involving disputed or mysterious historical photographs, and Emma trusted his analytical rigor. "Show me what you've found," he said, setting up his equipment. Emma walked him through the discovery step by step: the formal family portrait, the doll in the corner, the empty chair, the name Charlotte embroidered on the doll's dress, and finally, the reflected image in the doll's glass eye. She displayed the extreme magnification of the reflection on her largest monitor. Michael studied it in silence for several minutes, occasionally adjusting the image settings to examine it from different perspectives. Finally, he pulled the original photograph over to his spectral imaging equipment, a device that could photograph the image under different wavelengths of light to reveal details invisible to normal vision or standard cameras. "Let's see what's actually in this photograph versus what might have been added later," he said, beginning his analysis. Over the next 2 hours, he photographed the original under ultraviolet light, infrared light, and various other spectral ranges. Each imaging session revealed different aspects of the photograph's composition and history. The ultraviolet imaging showed that the photograph was indeed from the late 1880s, with chemical signatures consistent with photographic processes used during that period. There were no signs of later manipulation or retouching in the area of the doll's eyes. The reflection was part of the original exposure, not added afterward. The infrared imaging revealed something even more interesting. Under infrared light, certain details invisible in normal viewing became apparent. Michael pointed to his monitor, where the infrared image showed the faint outline of something written on the back of the photograph that had been partially erased or covered over. "There's text here that's been obscured," he said. "The ink has faded to the point where it's invisible under normal light, but infrared picks up the iron content in the original ink. Let me enhance this." Using specialized software, he brought out the hidden text. Slowly, words began to appear on the screen. "In memory of our beloved Charlotte, taken from us September 12, 1889, forever 4 years old. This photograph taken November 3, 1889. Her doll keeps watch until we meet again." Emma felt chills. This confirmed that Charlotte had been a real child, that she had died just 2 months before the photograph was taken, and that the doll had been deliberately included as a memorial presence. The phrase, "her doll keeps watch," was particularly poignant. It suggested the parents believed the doll, which had belonged to Charlotte, was somehow still connected to their daughter. But this didn't explain the reflected figure in the doll's eye, or the empty chair positioned so deliberately next to the doll. Michael returned to analyzing the reflection itself, using multiple enhancement techniques to bring out as much detail as possible. After extensive analysis, he sat back with a puzzled expression. "This reflection is genuine. It was present during the original photographic exposure. But I can't definitively say what it's showing. It could be a child who was standing near the photographer during the exposure." Armed with the confirmation that Charlotte had been a real child who died in September 1889, Emma knew she needed to find historical records that could tell her more about this family and the circumstances of Charlotte's death. She contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, a historian at Boston University who specialized in 19th century New England family history and had extensive experience with Victorian-era death records and genealogical research. Dr. E.St. Chen arrived that afternoon, immediately intrigued by the photograph and the mystery it presented. She photographed the inscription Michael had revealed, noting the specific dates, Charlotte's death on September 12, 1889, and the photograph taken November 3, 1889. "Let's start with death records," Sarah said, opening her laptop. She accessed the Massachusetts Vital Records database, searching for deaths of young girls named Charlotte in Boston during September 1889. Within minutes, she had found an entry. "Here," she said, turning the screen so Emma could see. "Charlotte Marie Hastings, age 4 years, died September 12, 1889 in Boston. Residence listed as Beacon Hill. Cause of death recorded as fever and complications." The entry was brief, as was typical for the period, but it confirmed the basic facts from the hidden inscription on the photograph. Sarah continued searching, pulling up census records, city directories, and property records to build a picture of the Hastings family. The father was Edward Hastings, a successful textile merchant with a warehouse in the Port District. The mother was Catherine Hastings, née Morrison, from a prominent Boston family. According to the 1890 census, taken just a few months after this photograph, they had 3 surviving children: Edward Jr., age 10, William, age 7, and Margaret, age 8. Emma did the math. If Charlotte died at age 4 in September 1889, she would have been the youngest child. The 3 children visible in the photograph matched the ages and genders of the surviving children. Sarah continued digging through historical records. She found newspaper archives from 1889 and searched for any mention of the Hastings family or Charlotte's death. What she discovered was disturbing. "There's a brief death notice in the Boston Globe from September 14, 1889, Sarah said, reading from the screen. "Charlotte Marie Hastings, beloved daughter of Edward and Catherine Hastings, died September 12th after a brief illness. Private funeral services will be held." That's all. Very minimal coverage for a family of their social standing. She searched further and found something more concerning. There's another entry here, from the Boston Medical Journal, October 1889. It's a case study, though the names are anonymized. Listen to this. "Case of suspected scarlet fever in a 4-year-old female patient, Beacon Hill residence. Child presented with high fever, rash, and throat inflammation. Family declined hospital admission despite medical recommendation. Child was treated at home with methods inconsistent with current medical practice. Death occurred within 5 days of initial symptoms. Autopsy declined by family." Emma and Michael exchanged troubled glances. "You think this is Charlotte?" Emma asked. Sarah nodded grimly. "The timing matches exactly. September 1889. 4-year-old girl, Beacon Hill, declined hospital treatment, declined autopsy. This reads like a doctor trying to document a case of medical negligence without directly accusing a prominent family." Over the following week, Sarah Chen conducted extensive research into the Hastings family, and what she uncovered painted an increasingly disturbing picture. She found records in the archives of Boston's Historical Medical Society, church records from the Hastings family's parish, and, most revealing, a series of letters written by Catherine Hastings to her sister in New York during 1888 and 1889. The letters had been preserved in a collection donated to the New York Historical Society and had never been closely examined by researchers. Sarah obtained digital copies, and she, Emma, and Michael read through them together, piecing together the tragic story of Charlotte's short life. In a letter dated March 1889, Catherine wrote, "Edward has become increasingly convinced that modern medical practices are ungodly and harmful. He has forbidden me from calling our regular physician, Dr. Morrison, and instead insists we consult only with a man who calls himself a natural healer, though I suspect he has no legitimate medical training whatsoever. I worry for the children's health." Another letter from June 1889 was more urgent. "Little Charlotte has been unwell for several weeks, a persistent cough and general weakness. I wanted to take her to Dr. Morrison, but Edward absolutely forbids it. His healer prescribes only prayer and strange herbal concoctions that seem to do nothing. Charlotte grows thinner each week, and I am frightened." The final letter mentioning Charlotte, dated September 10, 1889, just 2 days before her death, was desperate. "Charlotte is gravely ill. She has a terrible fever and can barely speak. Her throat is so inflamed she cannot swallow. I begged Edward to let me call for proper medical help, but he grew violent and locked me in my room for hours as punishment for my lack of faith. His wretched healer came and said Charlotte's illness is due to evil spirits and that we must pray more fervently. My darling child is dying, and I am powerless to save her." The letters after Charlotte's death revealed Catherine's profound guilt and grief. She wrote in October 1889, "Edward insists we must present a picture of faith and strength to society. He has commissioned a family photograph, though I can barely stand to participate. He says we must show that we accept God's will and remain a strong, united family. But I know the truth. Charlotte died because Edward's stubborn pride and dangerous beliefs prevented her from receiving proper medical care. I will carry this burden of guilt until I join her in death. Sarah also found records showing that the natural healer Edward Hastings had consulted was a man named Josiah Blackwood, who had been investigated multiple times by Boston medical authorities for practicing medicine without a license and had been linked to at least 3 other child deaths in the late 1880s. "This is criminal negligence," Michael said quietly. "Edward Hastings let his daughter die rather than accept modern medical treatment. And then he covered it up by refusing an autopsy and commissioning a family portrait to project normalcy and strength." Emma looked at the photograph with new horror. The doll, the empty chair, the grieving faces barely maintaining composure. It was all part of an elaborate performance designed to hide the truth of what had happened. Catherine had written about being forced to participate, to present a facade of acceptance and faith while drowning in guilt and rage. But there was still the question of the reflected figure in the doll's eye. Who or what had been standing there during the photograph? Sarah had one more piece of evidence to share. Sarah had continued researching the Hastings family and had made contact with a genealogist who specialized in Boston families. Through this connection, she had found a living descendant, a woman named Patricia Morrison, age 78, who was the great-great-granddaughter of Catherine Hastings through her daughter Margaret, the 8-year-old girl visible in the photograph. Patricia agreed to meet with the research team at Emma's office. She arrived on a gray November morning, bringing with her a small wooden box that had been passed down through her family for generations. "My grandmother told me stories about Charlotte," Patricia said as they gathered around Emma's examination table. "She said Charlotte's death had broken my great-great-grandmother Catherine's heart, and that there were dark secrets in the family that should be remembered, not hidden." She opened the wooden box. Inside were several items: a lock of light brown hair tied with a faded ribbon, a small pair of child's shoes, a few photographs of Catherine Hastings from later in her life, and, most significantly, a diary. "This belonged to Margaret, the oldest daughter," Patricia explained, carefully lifting the diary from the box. "She was 8 when Charlotte died, and she kept this diary for several years afterward. My grandmother said Margaret witnessed something during the photograph session that haunted her for the rest of her life." Sarah carefully opened the diary to entries from November 1889. Margaret's handwriting was careful and childish, but the content was chilling. The entry from November 3, 1889, the day of the photograph, read, "Today we had our portrait made. Father said we must look strong and faithful, and Mother must not cry. He brought Charlotte's doll and her little chair and said they would stand for her in the picture. But something strange happened. While the photographer was preparing his camera, I saw Charlotte. She was standing right behind the photographer, wearing her white Sunday dress. She looked sad and angry. I tried to tell Mother, but Father gave me such a look that I stayed quiet. When the photographer took the picture, there was a bright flash, and Charlotte was still there, staring at Father with the most terrible expression. Then she was gone. No one else seemed to see her. But her doll's eyes were looking right at where she had been standing. I think the doll saw her too." The room was silent as they absorbed Margaret's words. Emma pulled up the enhanced image of the reflection in the doll's eye and showed it to Patricia. "Could this be what Margaret saw?" Patricia studied the blurred reflected image, her eyes filling with tears. "My grandmother said Margaret insisted until her dying day that Charlotte appeared during that photograph. The family dismissed it as a child's imagination or grief-induced hallucination, but Margaret said she knew what she saw and that Charlotte had come to bear witness to what Father had done." Sarah had one more revelation to share. "I found Catherine's death record. She died in 1902 at age 45, relatively young. The cause of death was listed as laudanum overdose, accidental. But there was a note in her physician's records suggesting it might not have been accidental. She had apparently struggled with depression and guilt for years after Charlotte's death." Patricia nodded sadly. "Family stories say she never recovered from losing Charlotte. She knew it was preventable, knew her husband's stubborn pride and pseudoscientific beliefs had killed their daughter." Emma, Michael, and Sarah spent the next month compiling their research into a comprehensive report. They had uncovered not just the story of one family's tragedy, but evidence of a broader pattern of medical neglect and dangerous pseudoscientific practices in late 19th century Boston. Using Patricia Morrison's family documents, historical medical records, Catherine Hastings' letters, and Margaret's diary, they built a detailed timeline of Charlotte's illness and death. Medical historians they consulted confirmed that Charlotte's symptoms, as described in Catherine's letters and the anonymous medical journal case study, were consistent with scarlet fever, a disease that was often fatal in the 1880s but could sometimes be treated successfully with proper medical care and nursing. The natural healer Josiah Blackwood, whom Edward Hastings had insisted on consulting instead of licensed physicians, had a documented history of causing harm. Sarah found records showing he had been brought before Boston medical boards 3 times between 1886 and 1890, charged with practicing medicine without a license and with administering dangerous treatments that had resulted in patient deaths. In Charlotte's case, Blackwood's prescribed treatment, according to notations in his own records that Sarah found in a medical society archive, consisted of prayer, fasting, and herbal purgatives. He had explicitly advised against fever-reducing measures, against fluids for the dehydrated child, and against any consultation with actual physicians, claiming these would interfere with natural healing processes and divine intervention. A modern pediatrician they consulted reviewed the historical evidence and stated unequivocally, with proper medical care, even given the limitations of 1889 medicine, this child had a reasonable chance of survival. Scarlet fever was serious, but not always fatal. The treatment she received instead was not just ineffective, but actively harmful. The fasting and purgatives would have severely weakened an already ill child. This was medical negligence that directly contributed to her death. But perhaps most disturbing was what they discovered about the photograph itself. Emma, working with Michael, had done additional analysis of the entire image, not just the doll's eye. Using advanced digital techniques, they found evidence that the photograph had been carefully staged to present a specific narrative. The mourning flowers and wreath visible in the background were positioned to be just barely noticeable, present enough to suggest the family was in mourning and therefore deserved sympathy, but not so prominent as to invite questions about the circumstances of the death. The children's positioning and expressions had clearly been directed to show solemn unity rather than grief or trauma. Most tellingly, they found evidence of retouching on the original photograph. Edward Hastings' face had been subtly altered to remove signs of strain or guilt, making his expression appear more stern and righteous than it had been in the actual exposure. Catherine's face, in contrast, had been left unretouched, her grief and pain visible for anyone who looked closely. This photograph was commissioned as propaganda, Michael concluded. Edward Hastings used it to control the narrative about Charlotte's death, to present himself as a faithful, strong patriarch leading his family through a tragedy rather than what he actually was, a man whose dangerous beliefs had killed his daughter. The doll and the empty chair took on new significance in this context. They weren't just memorial objects, they were props in a calculated performance designed to evoke sympathy and deflect scrutiny. The research team faced an important decision: what to do with their findings. This wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was evidence of child abuse, medical negligence, and an elaborate cover-up. But everyone involved had been dead for decades. The question was whether exposing the truth served any purpose beyond historical accuracy. Patricia Morrison made the decision for them. "Charlotte's story needs to be told," she said firmly when they presented their findings to her. "Not to punish people who are long dead, but to honor Charlotte and to acknowledge what happened to her. My family has kept these secrets for over a century, and it's time for the truth." With Patricia's support and consent, Emma arranged for an exhibition at the Boston Historical Preservation Society titled "Hidden Truths: Victorian Family Secrets Revealed Through Photographic Analysis." The centerpiece was the Hastings family photograph, displayed alongside all the research materials. The enhanced images showing the reflection in the doll's eye, Margaret's diary entry, Catherine's letters, and the medical records documenting Charlotte's preventable death. The exhibition opened in December 2024 and drew significant public attention. News outlets covered the story, focusing on how modern technology had revealed secrets hidden in a 135-year-old photograph. But the story resonated beyond just the technical aspects. It spoke to broader issues about child welfare, medical neglect, and how families hide painful truths behind carefully constructed facades. Medical historians use the case to discuss the dangerous natural healing movements of the late 19th century and drew parallels to modern medical misinformation and vaccine hesitancy. Child welfare advocates referenced Charlotte's story in discussions about parental rights versus children's rights to proper medical care. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was personal. Patricia Morrison, working with Emma and Sarah, created a proper memorial for Charlotte. Using genealogical research, they located Charlotte's grave in a Boston cemetery, a small plain stone that had been largely forgotten and unmarked except for her name and dates. They arranged for a new memorial marker to be placed at the grave with an inscription that told Charlotte's true story. Charlotte Marie Hastings, 1885-1889. A beloved child whose death from preventable illness revealed the dangers of medical negligence disguised as faith, remembered by her sister Margaret, who bore witness, and by her mother Catherine, who carried the grief. May her story protect other children. The doll from the photograph, or rather, a doll matching its description, was discovered in Patricia's family collection. It had been passed down through Margaret's descendants, carefully preserved all these years. Patricia donated it to the exhibition, where it was displayed alongside the photograph in a glass case. Emma often stood in the exhibition hall, watching visitors examine the photograph and read the documentation. She thought about Margaret, 8 years old, seeing her dead sister's ghost during that photograph session and being silenced by her father's threatening look. She thought about Catherine, forced to participate in a performance that covered up her daughter's preventable death while she drowned in guilt and grief. And she thought about Charlotte herself, 4 years old, denied proper medical care because of her father's dangerous beliefs. Her short life ended unnecessarily. The reflection captured in the doll's glass eye, whether it was truly Charlotte's ghost or simply an artifact of light and shadow and Victorian photographic processes, had served its purpose. It had drawn attention, sparked investigation, and ultimately revealed the truth. On the anniversary of Charlotte's death, September 12, 2025, a small ceremony was held at her grave. Patricia Morrison was there, along with Emma, Sarah, Michael, and several members of Patricia's extended family, all descendants of the Hastings children who had survived. Charlotte was silenced in life and in death, Patricia said during the ceremony. Her father prevented her from receiving the medical care that might have saved her, then prevented an autopsy that might have revealed his negligence, then commissioned a photograph designed to hide the truth. But Margaret saw her. The doll captured her reflection, and now, 136 years later, she can finally be heard. They placed white lilies on the grave, the same flowers that had been in the photograph, symbols of death in Victorian culture, but also symbols of innocence and purity. And they left a small porcelain doll dressed in white to keep watch over Charlotte's resting place. Emma returned to her restoration work with renewed purpose. She realized that every old photograph potentially held hidden stories, and that modern technology gave her the tools to reveal truths that had been concealed for generations. Some were tragic, like Charlotte's. Others might be joyful discoveries of lost family connections or forgotten achievements. But all of them mattered. All of them deserved to be seen, understood, and remembered. The photograph of the Hastings family remained on display, a permanent reminder that what appears to be a simple family portrait can tell a much darker story. Visitors would stand before it, looking at the grieving mother, the complicit father, the traumatized children, the memorial doll in the corner, and the empty chair beside it. And if they looked very carefully at the enhanced display showing the doll's eye, they could see the faint reflected image of a small figure in white, Charlotte, bearing witness to the truth that her family had tried so hard to hide, her story finally told, her memory finally honored. The doll in the corner had indeed told a different story. And now, at last, that story had been heard.